May 1743. Dawn hangs low over Rathbussingbourne, England. The air is cold and damp. A thin mist drifts across the perimeter track, curling around the landing gear of a 4-engine bomber waiting in the half-light. Ground crew move quietly beneath the wings, their boots dark with dew. Oh, dew. No one speaks louder than necessary. Inside the cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress nicknamed Memphis Belle. The smell of oil and heated metal lingers from the engine run-up. Frost clings to the edges of the plexiglass. 24 combat missions are already etched into the memory of this aircraft and into the faces of the 10 young men strapped inside her. At the controls sits Captain Robert K. Morgan, 24 years old. His crew has flown over France, over the North Sea, over the industrial heart of Germany. They have watched other bombers fall away in smoke. They have counted parachutes that never opened. Today will be their 25th mission. In 1943, 25 missions did not mean glory. It meant survival, against odds that few truly understood. And to understand why this morning mattered, we have to step back into the war that brought them here. In early 1943, the air war over Europe was entering its most dangerous phase. The United States Army Air Forces had committed themselves to a bold and controversial strategy. Daylight precision bombing. Unlike Britain's Royal Air Force, which bombed German cities at night to reduce aircraft losses, American doctrine insisted that heavily armed bombers could defend themselves in tight formations under full daylight. The aircraft chosen to carry that belief was the B-17 Flying Fortress. Designed in the 1930s by Boeing, the B-17 was built around endurance and defence. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, a high wing for stability, and by 1943, up to 13 .50 caliber machine guns bristling from nose, dorsal, ventral waist, and tail positions. The concept was simple. If enough flying fortresses flew close together, their overlapping fields of fire would create a wall of defensive power no fighter could penetrate. On paper, it was convincing. In practice, Europe was not the Pacific. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its heavy bomber force was still developing. By mid-1942, the 8th Air Force began arriving in England. Airfields carved into the countryside. Crews trained rapidly. Missions began cautiously over occupied France. But Germany was not France. The deeper the bombers pushed into the Reich, the longer they flew without escort. American fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt did not yet have the range to accompany them all the way to central Germany. Beyond the protective radius of Allied fighters, the bombers were alone, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighter pilots quickly adapted to American formations. Head-on attacks exploited weak frontal defences. Coordinated assaults targeted stragglers. Heavy anti-aircraft artillery, flak, created lethal corridors of exploding steel thousands of feet above the ground. Each burst filled the sky with jagged fragments capable of tearing through aluminum skin, fuel lines, hydraulics or flesh. By late 1942, loss rates began climbing. A typical deep penetration raid could see 5, 10, sometimes 15% of aircraft shot down. That meant dozens of bombers lost in a single day. Hundreds of airmen killed or captured. The arithmetic was unforgiving. If a crew had to complete 25 missions before rotating home, and if average loss rates hovered between 5 and 8% per mission on major targets, statistical survival was never guaranteed. Some historians have estimated that during certain periods in 1943, a bomber crew's chance of completing 25 missions without being killed, wounded, or captured could fall below 50%. Every takeoff carried quiet calculation, and yet the missions intensified. German industry was resilient. Ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, submarine pens along the Atlantic coast, aircraft plants in Bremen and Kiel, oil refineries deep inside the Reich. The belief persisted that sustained, precise bombing could cripple Germany's ability to wage war. The bomber crews became the spearhead of that strategy. Young men, often barely out of college or high school, found themselves flying 6 to 8 hours over hostile territory at altitudes above 20,000 feet. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Oxygen masks froze. Frostbite was common. A single hit to an oxygen line could silently suffocate an entire crew. There were no ejection seats. If the aircraft caught fire or broke apart, survival depended on reaching a hatch, clipping on a parachute, and jumping into chaos. The myth of the flying fortress suggested invulnerability. The reality was attrition, and it was into this reality that a specific crew, 10 men who had trained together in the United States, arrived in England in late 1942, unaware that their aircraft's name would one day become legend. But at that moment, they were not symbols. They were simply the 324th Bomb Squadron, 91st Bomb Group, part of a growing force preparing to strike deeper into Germany than ever before. And before their aircraft was known across America, it was just another bomber taxiing into a widening war. The crew that would fly Memphis Belle did not assemble as legends. They formed the way most American bomber crews did, through training, proximity, and trust. Captain Robert K. Morgan was born in Asheville, North Carolina. Like many young men of his generation, he joined the Army Air Forces before the United States had fully mobilized. He trained as a pilot in 1941 and 1942, mastering multi-engine aircraft under a compressed wartime schedule. Bomber crews were typically organized around a pilot and co-pilot, then filled out with a navigator, bombardier, radio operator, flight engineer, and gunners. Morgan chose some of his men. Others were assigned. Over months of stateside preparation, first in Florida, then at advanced training bases across the South and Midwest, the crew learned to function as a single organism inside aluminum skin. They practiced formation, flying in tight boxes. They rehearsed emergency drills. They memorized procedures for engine fires, hydraulic failures, decompression, oxygen loss. They learned to change machine gun barrels in sub-zero wind blast. They studied German aircraft recognition charts. They were young. Most were in their early 20s. In September 1942, the crew sailed to England. The Atlantic crossing itself was dangerous. German U-boats prowled shipping lanes. Upon arrival, they were assigned to the 91st Bomb Group at RAF Bassingbourn, a windswept field north of London. There, the war became immediate. The bomber they would fly, a B-17 Flying Fortress designated B-17F, serial number 4124,485, received its now famous name from Morgan's girlfriend back home in Tennessee. The nose art, painted in cursive script, read in Memphis Belle. Nose art was common. It gave personality to machinery. It also invited fate. Their first mission came on November 7, 1942, against submarine pens at Brest, France. Compared to later raids, it was considered moderate risk. Yet even over occupied France, German anti-aircraft fire was precise and aggressive. The second mission was worse. By December 1942 and January 1943, the 8th Air Force increased its operational tempo. Crews were flying multiple missions per week, weather permitting. Targets expanded to include industrial centres in Germany itself. The Belle flew to Lorient, to Saint-Nazaire, to Rouen. Then deeper, to Wilhelmshaven. Each mission followed a ritual. Wake before dawn. Briefing room. A curtain pulled aside to reveal a red string stretching across a map toward the day's target. A low murmur from assembled crews. Intelligence officers outlining expected fighter opposition. Flak concentrations, weather forecasts, then the walk to the aircraft. Takeoff in heavy formation demanded precision. B-17s lifted off heavily loaded with fuel and bombs, climbing slowly into formation circles above England before crossing the Channel in tight combat boxes. Once over occupied territory, the atmosphere shifted. Flak began first, black bursts blooming ahead like sudden storms. Then fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s would dive through formations, firing twin-team cannon shells capable of shredding control surfaces. The Belle endured damage early in her tour. On one mission, a shell fragment tore through the tail section. On another, hydraulic systems were compromised. Crew members were injured on different flights. Minor wounds, but reminders of fragility, and each time they returned. By early spring 1943, the crew understood something unspoken. Survival was cumulative. Every completed mission increased experience. It also increased tension. Losses around them mounted. The 8th Air Force began suffering days when entire formations failed to return intact. Replacement crews arrived constantly at Bassingbourn. Some lasted weeks, some lasted days. The required tour remained fixed at 25 missions. It was an arbitrary number in some ways, a balance between operational necessity and morale. Completing 25 missions meant rotation, home, arm. It meant escape from the statistical grind. But as 1943 progressed, that number felt increasingly monumental, and quietly, without public announcement, Morgan's crew moved through their missions. 10, 12, 15, while the skies over Europe grew more lethal. They were not yet famous. They were simply surviving, but as their mission count approached 20, headquarters began to notice, because few crews were reaching that number intact. And that fact would begin to change how their story was seen, not only by the men inside the aircraft, but by the military leadership watching loss charts rise across England. The Belle was no longer just another bomber. She was becoming an anomaly in a war that punished predictability. And to understand why her survival stood out, we must look at this story from multiple angles. The human strain, the tactical realities, the machinery, and the enemy determined to stop them. Inside a B-17 flying fortress, space was limited. Movement was restricted. Privacy did not exist. 10 men occupied compartments connected by narrow crawlways. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Heated flight suits were unreliable. Oxygen masks pressed tightly against faces for hours. Condensation froze along the inside of the fuselage. Combat was not constant, but tension was. For the crew of Memphis Belle, each mission added weight. The first few flights were dominated by adrenaline. The 10th introduced routine. By the 20th, routine gave way to anticipation of loss. They saw aircraft disappear. Sometimes it was sudden, an explosion mid-air. Sometimes slower, a crippled bomber falling behind formation, smoke trailing, fighters circling like predators. The worst moments were silent ones. A bomber slightly out of position. A hit to an engine. The formation moving on because it had to. No radio chatter. No farewell. The crew bond became survival itself. Navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, waist gunners, tail gunner, each relied completely on the others. A missed warning from the tail could mean a fatal blind spot. A delayed bomb release could compromise formation timing. A damaged engine required instant coordination between pilot and engineer. Sleep was shallow between missions. Briefings replayed in memory. The sound of flak, sharp metallic cracks against aluminum, lingered long after landing. Statistically, their chances narrowed with every sortie. Psychologically, they adopted rituals. Some crews carried charms. Others refused to shave before missions. Some avoided discussing the future altogether. Morgan's crew maintained professionalism. But professionalism did not erase fear. It simply controlled it. By the time they reached their 20th mission, the Belle's crew had begun to count not forward, but backward. 5 to go. 4 to go. 4 to go. The human mind measures survival in increments. And yet, survival did not depend on courage alone. It depended on the systems surrounding them. Because beyond individual fear lay the rigid structure of American daylight bombing doctrine. The United States Army Air Forces believed in formation. Bombers did not fly alone. They flew in combat boxes, staggered vertical and horizontal groupings designed to maximize defensive firepower. A single B-17 was vulnerable. 12 overlapping B-17s were meant to be formidable. The theory relied on discipline. Each aircraft had to hold exact position, drift too far, and gaps opened. More gaps invited attack. During the Belle's tour in late 1942 and early 1943, escort fighters lacked the range to cover the entire route to deep German targets. American P-47 Thunderbolts could accompany bombers partway, but once fuel limits were reached, they turned back. From that moment forward, the bombers were alone. German fighter controllers tracked incoming formations via radar. Interceptors were vectored to ideal attack positions, often head-on. A frontal assault reduced exposure time to defensive guns and targeted the cockpit and bombardier compartment. Head-on passes were devastating. The B-17F variant flown by Memphis Belle lacked the fully powered chin turret that later models would carry. Its nose armament was comparatively weaker. This vulnerability was quickly recognized by the Luftwaffe. As a result, formations flying in 1943 absorbed repeated frontal attacks before reaching targets. Flak added another layer. German anti-aircraft batteries were calibrated for altitude and speed. Over major industrial cities, layers of heavy 80 ATOM guns created timed explosions at precise heights. The sky filled with black bursts, each detonation throwing fragments outward at supersonic speed. Flak did not need to score direct hits. A near burst could puncture fuel tanks, sever control cables, injure crew members, or shatter windshields. Even minor damage compounded over time. And yet the doctrine held. Precision bombing required daylight. Daylight required formation. Formation required discipline under fire. Memphis Belle flew within that system. Each mission demanded strict adherence, hold position, maintain altitude, stay in the box no matter what, because breaking formation increased individual survival in the short term, but endangered the group. This was the tension every pilot understood, and as their mission count climbed, the risks did not diminish, they intensified, because German defences adapted with each passing month, and the story of Memphis Belle cannot be understood without examining the machinery that carried them, or the enemy determined to tear it apart. The reputation of the B-17 Flying Fortress rested on durability. Its structure was built around a semi-monocoque fuselage and robust wing spars capable of absorbing significant structural damage. Combat reports from 1942 and 1943 describe B-17s returning to England with entire sections of tail missing, engines feathered, control surfaces shredded. The aircraft flown by the crew of Memphis Belle was a B-17F model. It carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs on shorter-range missions, somewhat less on deeper penetrations. Defensive armament included twin, 50 caliber machine guns in the top turret, twin guns in the bore turret beneath the fuselage, single or twin mounts in the waist positions, a tail gun pair, and flexible guns in the nose compartment. But the B-17F had limitations. Its forward defensive coverage was incomplete. The nose lacked the powered chin turret introduced later in the B-17G variant. German pilots quickly exploited this weakness with head-on cannon attacks. And the final stretch of their tour would coincide with some of the most heavily defended targets yet attempted. The sky was growing denser with fire, and soon survival would no longer be theoretical. It would hinge on a handful of final missions that tested the limits of aircraft doctrine and endurance. By April 1943, the crew of Memphis Belle had crossed a threshold. 20 missions completed. 5 remaining. In the mathematics of the 8th Air Force, that number carried quiet tension. The difference between 20 and 25 was not incremental. It was absolute. Many crews were lost in the final stretch. Fatigue accumulated. German defences intensified as American raids pushed deeper into the Reich. On April 17, 1943, the Belle flew against the port city of Bremen. Bremen was not a peripheral target. It housed shipyards, submarine construction facilities, and industrial plants integral to Germany's naval war effort. It was heavily defended, layers of flak batteries coordinated with fighter interception units. The formation encountered resistance early. German fighters pressed head-on attacks as the bombers approached the coast. Cannon fire flashed through the formation. Reports later noted damage across multiple aircraft in the group. The Belle absorbed hits that tore through outer skin and severed electrical wiring. One engine showed fluctuating oil pressure. Still, she held formation. The discipline drilled into Morgan, and his crew left little room for improvisation. Stray from the box and the aircraft became isolated. Stay inside and the collective defensive fire increased odds. They reached the bomb run. For several minutes the aircraft flew straight and level. Exposed, flak bursts bracketed the formation. Black smoke puffs filled the air at their altitude, some exploding dangerously close. Fragments punched through control surfaces, plexiglass cracked. A crew member later described the sound as metal being crushed by invisible fists. Bombs released. The formation turned for home. Return was not relief. German fighters attacked again as the bombers withdrew. One aircraft in the group fell out of formation, trailing smoke. The Belle's gunners reported hits on attacking fighters, but confirmation in aerial combat was uncertain. The channel appeared eventually beneath them, a grey strip dividing combat from temporary safety. They landed at Bassingbourn with visible damage. Ground crews counted holes in wings and fuselage. Mechanics replaced control cables. Armourers inspected gun mounts. 4 missions to go. The pattern continued. Late April brought another strike against Wilhelmshaven. Early May included missions to Lorient and other fortified Atlantic targets. Each operation layered fatigue onto the crew. Records indicate that during one late tour mission, a flak burst detonated close enough to wound a crew member with shrapnel. It was not fatal, but it was a reminder that survival was often measured in inches. Meanwhile, losses across the 8th Air Force remained steady. The cumulative strain on crews was visible at briefings. Replacement aircraft filled dispersal areas where others had once stood. Memorial services became routine. By mid-May 1943, the Belle stood at 24 completed missions. One remained. Headquarters confirmed the final target. Kiel was a critical naval base on Germany's Baltic coast, home to submarine yards and naval infrastructure. It was distant. It was defended. It would require a long flight over hostile territory. The irony was unspoken. After months of survival after evading flak and fighters across France and Western Germany, the final mission would be one of the most heavily protected targets yet attempted. On May 16, 1943, the crew prepared equipment. Heated suits checked. Oxygen lines inspected. Guns cleaned and reloaded. Parachutes folded carefully. Sleep was limited. There was no celebration in advance, because statistics did not honour anticipation. On American soil, the Belle symbolised endurance and triumph. In European skies, the cost of daylight bombing was still being paid daily. And as the legend of Memphis Belle expanded through film and media, the broader reality of the bomber war grew even more severe. While the crew of Memphis Belle travelled across the United States promoting war bonds, the air war over Europe entered its most punishing phase. In August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force launched deep strikes against the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and aircraft factories at Regensburg. These missions suffered catastrophic losses. On October 14, 1943, later known as a Black Thursday, 60 B-17s were shot down in a single raid on Schweinfurt. The arithmetic that had haunted bomber crews earlier in the year became undeniable. Daylight bombing without full fighter escort carried immense cost. By that point, the required combat tour had already been raised to 30 missions, then eventually to 35 as aircraft production and escort capability improved. For crews arriving in late 1943 and 1944, survival demanded even more exposure. The Belle's 25 missions had been flown before the introduction of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which would later accompany bombers deep into Germany and significantly reduce loss rates. The crew had operated during a transitional period when American confidence in formation defence was being tested against hardened German resistance. After the war bond tour, the aircraft itself was retired from combat service. Unlike many B-17s that were scrapped after the war, Memphis Belle survived, but not without neglect. For decades, the aircraft sat outdoors in Memphis, Tennessee, exposed to weather and corrosion. Pieces were removed, structural damage accumulated, the legend endured, the machine deteriorated. Meanwhile, the men who had flown her returned to military or civilian life. Captain Robert K. Morgan continued flying during the war and later transitioned to civilian aviation. Other crew members resumed careers, some remaining in aviation, others moving into entirely different professions. Like many veterans, they carried private memories not fully captured in wartime documentaries. Their survival did not erase what they had witnessed. The 8th Air Force ultimately lost more than 4,000 heavy bombers over Europe. Approximately 26,000 American airmen were killed in the European air campaign. Thousands more were wounded or captured. These figures placed the Belle's completed tour in perspective. It was exceptional, not because it was impossible, but because statistical survival in early 1943 was uncertain. Decades later, restoration efforts began in earnest. The aircraft was transferred to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. There, a painstaking, multi-year restoration project sought to return the bomber to its wartime configuration, correct paint scheme, accurate nose art, authentic interior layout. In May 2018, after years of structural repair and research, the restored Memphis Belle went on public display. Visitors now walk beneath its wings in a quiet museum hall. They see aluminum skin once torn by flak. They see the nose art that travelled from an English airfield to American stadiums. What they do not feel is the vibration of engines at 25,000 feet, the concussion of flak bursts, the claustrophobic cold, But the aircraft remains, not as propaganda, not as myth, as a surviving artifact of an air campaign that reshaped modern warfare. And with time, the story of Memphis Belle has settled into a different tone, less triumphal, more reflective. Because survival in war is rarely simple, and what this crew endured raises a larger question about technology, doctrine, and the human cost of strategic bombing. The story of Memphis Belle endures not because it was unique in courage, but because it was rare in outcome. In the spring of 1943, completing 25 combat missions in a B-17 Flying Fortress over occupied Europe required more than training. It required weather that shifted at the right moment. Flak bursts that detonated feet away instead of inches. Fighter attacks that broke off just soon enough. Mechanical systems that held together under strain required probability bending slightly, repeatedly, towards survival. Captain Robert K. Morgan and his crew did not defeat the Luftwaffe alone. They did not end the war from 25,000 feet. What they represented was endurance inside a strategy still being tested. The daylight bombing doctrine would evolve. Escort fighters would extend their reach. Loss rates would eventually decline. But in early 1943, none of that was certain. Memphis Belle flew in that uncertainty. Today, preserved in a museum hall, the aircraft appears static, almost serene, aluminum polished, nose art intact, guns silent. Yet its story carries the weight of an era when industrial warfare stretched across continents and survival depended on discipline, machinery, and fragile human resolve. The legend grew through film and ceremony. The reality was colder, louder, more statistical. 25 missions, 10 men, 1 aircraft returning through skies that did not promise mercy. And in that narrow window of survival, a symbol was born, not of invincibility, but of how thin the margin could be between memory and loss.